Hi guys, it's Jessica. Today we're going to cover different werewolf reads I've read so far in 2021, and we're going to tackle that in an episode I'm calling The Werewolf Den. Oh, oh, oh! Because this is kind of a new format and I had a lot of things I wanted to say about some of these different werewolf books, I do have some notes here. Guys, that werewolf howl was a life mistake because now Willow thinks it is her time to shine and she is getting all of the attention. The first series I'm going to talk about is Willow's Forbidden Path by Avery. I did a workshop on it that you can check out over here. It is about a person who is female by night and male by day. This person was born into a werewolf pack, but they're at 22 and they still haven't shifted into a werewolf because there was some mixed lineage in her bloodline. I think maybe she doesn't have a wolf even though she has a lot of werewolf-like instincts. Her dad isn't just a werewolf pack leader, he's also kind of like a mafia boss. And because of that, he really wanted like a male heir, so there's quite a bit of like sexism where she were a man all the time. And he has been abusive to his daughter, and she has an amazing best friend who is a witch, Aurelia. She's like my favorite character in the whole series. I love Aurelia. And she also has a male friend slash boyfriend. They have gone back and forth between like being friends, being enemies, and being lovers. And the story's sort of about Willow finding herself and also about her desire to eventually topple her father. Its plot is kind of muddy. There's multiple love interests. I do believe this book ends up being a reverse harem. And part of the reason this reverse harem is weird is because there's like a very strong couple relationship between her and this dude. And it's a pretty sweet relationship. He is really dedicated to her. He seems to really care about her. She really cares about him. They've grown up together. So it's just kind of weird when they start entering new people into the relationship. The best friend Aurelia and Willow all have like this really tight-knit group. So if there's going to be a reverse harem, it almost feels like it should be a reverse harem with Aurelia, the dude, and Willow, and not like these new outsiders who come in and start to shake things up. The new outsider pack is really what gives Willow an opportunity to finally get one over on her father. The book starts to go really weird at the end of it. It starts to do like these chosen ones, secret royalty pack, secret bloodline. It starts to get really like, you're the special snowflake, which viewers might know I'm not a big fan of. Even though there were times where I thought about putting the book down, I was thinking like, I'm done with this is too long, this is too much. I would get to a point where we would just have a moment, and I would just enjoy that moment so much it would carry me to the next part. There were definitely parts of this book where I was laughing out loud, I was clapping, or doing like a victory. The second book is called Wolf Endangered, and I only got about 17% of the way through it. It's also 900 pages long. The thing you need to know about the second book is it starts the same night the first book ended on. I was 17% of the way through this book and still was on that first night. That is too long to be focused on one night. So I ended up putting it down. Within this series, there's a lot of fun, campy things happening, and it is so long, which can be a pro or a con. 950 pages is no joke. So overall, I'd probably give this series 3 stars. I'm probably not going to go back to the second book, and I'm probably not going to pick up the third, but I would understand why people would want to, because there is a lot of that fun urban fantasy flair. There's like that secret underbelly crime thing going on. There's so many parts of it that are fun and campy, and there's like this level of violence and enjoying in the violent escalation that I think sometimes can be great fun escapism. The next werewolf series I want to cover is The Sworn Saga by Avery Ellison. This one I did a workshop on the first 3 books, which you can find here. I loved the first book and was okay with the second book. Didn't like the third book. Was back in the 4th book and was so excited when Crimson Heart released earlier this summer. And then I ended up being confused. The reason that I started reading these books is because it's a play on the Red Riding Hood series. And as far as that goes, we've got Meredith/Red. She literally has the red cape going on. We have her love interest, the Silver Wolf. He has some big bad wolf vibes, but he's also sort of reversing that role. We have Meredith's grandmother who ended up raising Meredith from 8 onward. We have the huntsman involved. And we do have some other fairy tale names, even though they don't do a lot for their fairy tale character. So there is some of that fun harkening back to fairy tales. And there is some of that fun, like,
this is the story you know, I've twisted it in these ways.
But there isn't quite enough. And the other thing, and this is true with all the Kate Avery Ellison series I've read, her series don't continue to give you the same thing as they go forward. Like, I read the Kingmaker series before this, and the books changed drastically, like what they're about. They started as this personal individual story, and they start to become very Game of Thrones-esque by the end, which was weird, and I didn't care for it. And in this one, it started as a personal Meredith story, and then it changed over to like girls being abused in a boarding school, Hunger Games, arena fighting kind of story. The third book just went off the rails and was too slow and badly paced. I don't even know. The fourth book, we have Meredith coming into her own, and she is a lot stronger, and she's finally behaving in almost like a Robin Hood-esque way that I really enjoyed. I liked that book the best. And then the fifth book is also a confused mess that reminded me a lot of the third book, except it wasn't quite bad. It just wasn't like anything else that had come before it. I'm not really sure what it did for us plot-wise. I think some of the character beats are repeated too often. I think she lost the thread of the fairy tale that she was weaving back in and out. It's like she found it in book 4, and she told a little bit of like a Robin Hood instead of a Red Riding Hood fairy tale. And then in book 5, she just deviated away from anything even kind of resembling fairy tales, at least to me. And she also is really obsessed with this relationship going on between Meredith and the Silver Wolf. I don't think that their relationship always serves the plot well. And I think her dedication to their relationship, their will they, won't they, is indicative of the fact that this is like more of a young adult kind of story, and maybe the audience for this will appreciate it more than I did. I'd probably give the series so far overall a 3-star, with some outstanding 4 or 5 stars and some low points that are sitting at 2 stars. And I'm totally going to read the 6th book. I really am interested in the conclusion. And if you guys want to hear more about this, if you want me to do a workshop on Crimson Heart, go ahead and leave me a comment down below, because workshop, it takes a lot of work for me. I have to reread the story, I have to read quotes, all of that. And I didn't like Crimson Heart enough that I want to reread it, but I would if you guys would like to see how I would change the story up until now. The next series I want to talk about is the Skybrook series by McKenzie Hunter. I talk about this series in my 5 empathetic leading ladies here, and I also mention it briefly in 5 compelling relationships in fiction here. One of the things that makes this series stand out over the others is that it is a new adult urban fantasy story, and it's definitely more urban fantasy than romance, and more focused on action, world building, mystery, and problem solving. Skybrook, even though she's been dealing with the fact that she's a werewolf for a long time, she didn't know there were other shifters like her. So she is violently introduced to this when some vampires break into her house, murder her mother, and the shifters come and save her. And this ends up being a little bit of her realigning her worldview, finding her place in this new world, and sort of coming to terms with who she is in a way that she's never done before. I love that Sky has a job in this series. I love the world building for both the real world and the magical world. The two of them interact really well. It is a 7-book series, which is longer, so that gives McKenzie Hunter lots of time to introduce a bunch of different magical races and magical cultures and magical systems, and she does all of this really well. It's something that you can start to theorize about or start to like make predictions about going forward. At the core of this series, there's always kind of a whodunit mystery. I like the vampires in this series a lot. They're vicious, they're mean, they're complicated. There's some of them that I enjoy, some of them I don't like, and they're connecting relationships to each other and to other werewolves, and then how they have to navigate that makes it very interesting. The other thing that's fun about this book is even in the shifter group itself, it's not just wolves or coyotes, but they have large cats, they have a viper, they have bears. So there's a bunch of different kinds of animal shifting and how that gets navigated. how all of them have different instincts, how they work together as a pack. It's got a found family kind of feel to it, and the found family that Sky ends up building, even though she has been encouraged and told that it can only be within the pack, she does end up bringing other races and other groups together as well. An interesting independent streak in a character that starts off pretty weak and helpless. Next series I'm going to talk about is the Soul Bitten Shifter series by Avery, and I never ended up talking about this series on video before. Part of the reason I didn't is because there's a lot of things about it I really like, but at its core, there are some relationship dynamics that are happening that make me really uncomfortable. Let me go ahead and talk about the good things first. I thought that the werewolf pack situation was interesting and compelling. There is a lot of Norse mythology that gets woven into this, and there's also some Greek mythology as well. I loved how they took these myths and spun them in a new way and made a new, interesting, compelling plot with them. The mythological elements of this story are so good that I feel like I should be recommending it just because of that. Wish I could. I wish that there weren't these troubling elements that I also have to talk about as well. This Soul Bitten series would definitely classify as a darker story. I don't think it's a romantic story. I don't think it's romance at all, even though there is a relationship and there is a happily ever after. And I don't think it's an urban fantasy, even though it is definitely a fantasy series happening in the modern world. There isn't enough of those realistic grounding elements for me to call it an urban fantasy. I don't even know what genre you put this in. I do think it's geared towards young adults, which makes these troubling relationship elements even more concerning, at least to me, because it romanticizes a lot of different abuse and control aspects in relationships that are dangerous red flags. And our protagonist has a high level of tolerance and forgiveness. Yes, they can be complicated, and yes, the victim is allowed to forgive whoever they want to on their own terms, but I think it sets her up to be in further abusive, traumatizing situations. And I don't think she's allowed to fully heal and process in a way where she's up for actually deciding if she wants to forgive anyone or not. They do take our lead to a women's shelter, and I love that there is a women's shelter. I love how the women's shelter is portrayed. I love the other women characters we get from this who are also in different kinds of dangerous situations they're recovering and healing from. I love the kind of female friendships we get from this. This is like probably a third of the first book, and I really enjoyed this third and was hoping that we were going to continue with this kind of healing journey for our protagonist and for these other women. But then they pull her out of the safety of this shelter, I think before she's ready and before she's done healing, and they sort of re-traumatize her several different ways, several different times, and she never ends up going back to the healing house, really. Some of her relationships with these other women are tested and pulled away from in ways that are strange and odd. The romantic love interest, I just can't be okay with him. I know he also has trauma. I know he's also working through some other things, and I know there's a lot of pressure for him and outside forces they have to deal with. They can't just focus in on themselves and their own healing. There's a larger story happening, but I think the two of them together are highly toxic, especially the way they portray the werewolf mating system, the submission dominance situation going on, the alpha versus everybody else thing. It's just gross and it's too controlling. So even though the world building from a fantasy perspective is really great, the mythology is amazing, and overall I think I enjoyed the book. It's hard for me to recommend it to people because his relationship is so toxic and it takes up so much of the story. I don't think it's ever like explained or explored or acknowledged in a way that really gives the reader something. It's just like this ugly thing that's there in the book, and I think it might even be portrayed in a way that like you're supposed to idealize the relationship or you're supposed to enjoy that dynamic, and I just didn't feel that way about this. On top of that, the fact that it's a young adult story that is idealizing and suggesting that this kind of relationship is good or something to champion just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. If you're an adult looking at this right now, it might be worth checking out. And if you're a young adult, as long as you're going in and you know that this relationship in here is not great, Next series I want to talk about is The Alpha Queen Legacy by Laurel Knight. I actually recommended this book in a Werewolf Corner. I had my first corner reads here, and actually all the books we're talking about going forward are mentioned previously in the Werewolf Corner. I just am updating now where I stand with the series. I still love that first book. It's really campy. It's got the Alana, the lioness kind of glow on it because we have a female protagonist that is being a soldier in an area where women usually aren't soldiers, and she's the best soldier, and she's kicking butt and taking name, and she is bowing to no one, which I just love. But the second book is where things start to go awry for me. Looking back on it, some of the seeds of where things are not going to work out are in the first book. So the world we're in is another dystopian post-apocalyptic setting where humans were struggling against a zombie vampire style creature that was overtaking them, and they developed werewolves to save them. And humans have gone extinct. All that's left are these werewolves and these zombie vampire things, and they're continuing to fight over territory and try to push these mindless zombie vampire things back. It blends future tech and some interesting future things with some of the living off the land kind of things you get when your society is collapsed. But some of the problem with having a post-apocalyptic future tech society like this is that for some reason the women are still always subservient to the men. Like our main character, part of how she stands out is that she's so dominant or whatever. So that's really weird to me that all the women for some reason more submissive than men. After all, like the wolf genealogy makes them just as strong as the men in a lot of ways, but for some reason female wolves are inherently submissive. Doesn't follow what we know about nature. We all know that the Alpha Omega system was disproven by the same person who put the theory out originally. And usually I let that go in werewolf stories because almost all of them follow this Alpha Omega thing, but it's kind of weird to do so in one that's so science-based, where they're using science to justify why the wolves are like this. They have like this science genealogy evolution thing that they're perpetuating as a theory. And they have, all these futuristic gadgets and stuff, and they explain the evolution of that. So it's just weird that within this, they're using bad science. And the other element of bad science that comes into play is that there's a rule across all of the werewolf packs that you have to find your mate by 20 or you get kicked out. And this is specifically for reproductive purposes. So your mate is not going to be someone of the same gender. You have to pair up with someone of the opposite gender, and you have to have a baby. So that's really erasing for any LGBTQA+. And it's like,
so did they just kick out all the gay and lesbian people when they turned 20? Did they force them into relationships they didn't want? What happened there? Did everyone just stop being not straight when this apocalypse hit? I don't know.
And it's really kind of reductive to make people only worth their biology and make it so they have to reproduce, and if they don't continue the species, they're not really worth anything. They can't bring anything else to society. What happens to infertile people? You can have an accident or be sick or have some kind of disposition where you just can't have children. Are you kicked out as well? It's oversimplified, and it's oversimplified in a way that has some obvious traps in it. And I think probably the final nail in the coffin for me, the first book, Wolf Shun, has our protagonist in a pretty serious relationship with one of her future love interests. It's obvious that she loves him and he loves her, and the two of them care about each other very much. So when we introduce other relationships and we start to create an artificial reason for this relationship to go south, kind of demoralizing, they say that the two of them can't be together because her wolf is too dominant for him and she has to submit to the male in order for them to become mates, or it won't satisfy some kind of wolf thing. Since that's not ever explained in a way that makes sense with what we know scientifically about wolves or what we know about humans, it stands out as weird. The natural conflict in this book, relationship-wise, should wrap up is the two of them should end up together, and they should find out that it doesn't matter who's submissive and who's dominant as long as they work together well in a pair. And the other thing about this is how they get around the fact that she never wins in any one-on-one combat, and this is a big spoiler. It's at the end of book to all the guys gang up against her and force her to lose a battle between all 5. And that was really gross. I mean, they didn't do anything sexual, they just fought her. But at the same time, I didn't like that they didn't talk to her about the situation, because they could have been like,
here's how we're going to solve this problem. All 5 of us are going to fight you, and then we're going to win, because we're a team, and that's the only way we can beat you. And once we do that, our wolves will be mated, and we can work on a relationship from there.
At this point in time, she's starting to form an emotional relationship with these people. She wants to continue to stay with them after they're all kicked out of the packs. So she might have been like,
hey, that's kind of shitty that the only way you can beat me is to gang up like that, and I'm not super cool with that. We're going to have words about you being dishonorable, but I'm glad that we found a solution, and yeah, we can all hang out together and figure things out from there.
Or I guess she could have said no. Maybe they were too afraid, so they kind of forced it on her. They never adequately explain why that conversation doesn't happen. I don't think they ever make up for it. And I'm just so not okay with that fight happening in a non-consensual way that forces all of them into a relationship against her will. I read book 3 just to see if they're going to eventually address that in a way that would be satisfactory to me. They don't. So I'm not going to continue with this series. Sometimes it feels like the author doesn't know where the story is going and doesn't know how the story is going to end. And she's right there with her characters trying to figure it out and solve it as she's writing. And I don't like that feeling either. Certainly, she has a pretty organized way the story is going. She's hinted that the zombie thing might be kind of intelligent. We're getting building clues on that. She has outlined exactly who our protagonist has to speak to get the different parts to pull it together and save the people. So from that way, it seems like it's really outlined. But as far as like what actually happens when she goes to talk to these people, it feels like the author also doesn't know and is hoping she's going to write herself out of a hole as she goes along. And then the next book I want to talk about is the Rejected Mate series by G. Bailey and Scarlett Snow. This first book was wild. It has this like personal fairy tale kind of feel where the main character's mother is escaping hell and kind of makes a deal with the devil to hand her over. That's very fairy tale-esque. We see this character finally learn about her future marriage to like the evil king or whatever, and the evil king kills her mother and she escapes in the mayhem. It's all super fairy tale-like. And that's when the story sort of turns into a Hunger Games arena fight. They enter some demon hunting trials where there's a bunch of backstabbing and nefarious stuff. The winner gets something special. She starts to fall in love with 3 different guys, and the balance on that is really nice. You can see why she likes all 3 of them, and you get to learn with her about different kinds of demons, different demon hunting strategies, how they interact with humanity. We get a little bit of that urban fantasy feel. Loved the first book. It was a lot of fun. It was a little all over the place, but it was kind of like taking the best elements from those different places and weaving a narrative together. Things got weird in the second book, though. Right away, we open up with a fairy fae character who's very different from any of the other different races and creatures we've met and feels out of place in this story. She confirms a prophecy about one of the 3 love interests being the intended mate for our main character. And the 2 of them spend a lot of time together and they start playing out like their end game, and none of the others get to hang out with her anymore. This is when I started to realize that the one guy that we latched onto is not as interesting as I thought he was originally. What was interesting about him was the mystery, but once that mystery is unraveled, he's not that much fun anymore. The protagonist herself isn't that interesting, and she really needs the rest of the cast around her to help make the story exciting and energetic. And because we're missing parts of that cast for long periods of time, she's like traveling by herself to different realms. The book is not as much fun when it's not Hunger Games arena kind of stuff. The backstabbing, the mystery, all of that feels sort of sucked out of it. There's less timeline and urgency going on. And even though there are different challenges happening, it's executed clumsily. I'm definitely going to read the 3rd book when it comes out. I am really interested in checking out some of Scarlett Snow's work because I think it's her hand in these stories that I like, and I think it's G. Bailey's hand that makes this a little bit of a mess. Last book series I want to talk about is the Bound to the Fae series by Eva Chase. And I am just going to mention this one very briefly. I love it. I have mentioned it in my first quarter, my second quarter, and in my Eva Chase books review. It is technically about fae and not about werewolves, but one of the fae is a group of fae who transform into wolves. And that's where we get these really interesting pack dynamics, this found family scenario, and we get some of those werewolf instincts going on. And I think it's encapsulating a lot of the best elements that can happen in a werewolf shifter story. I've read a bunch of other werewolf stories this year, but those are the 7 that I would keep in my werewolf den. As always, keep reading, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye!